good evening, good afternoon, good morning, and good day to everyone. My name is Gabriel. I'm from Blockshow. I'm the head of strategy and also the head of content internally. We're actually working with the Singapore FinTech Festival this year. And as you can see, we're doing everything online, right? But online doesn't mean we don't have interesting opportunities and interesting conversations. And with regards to interesting conversation, I have a gentleman with me right now that's actually going to be joining me for a fireside chat. I'm actually going to be asking him questions and I'm going to let him share his opinions and everything. And it's none other than Balaji himself. How are you, sir, today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm very glad we have the opportunity to do this. And, I'm just very happy that, you basically spared us the time to do this and everything. So we're going to go into a short introduction about you. But instead of doing that 5-minute thing that every moderator asks you to do, why don't we just do it a little bit different? And then you see whether I'm accurate about it. So we're going to be talking about the impact of decentralization. We're going to talk about what's actually happened, where the space is now, and where potentially it can be tomorrow, both literally and illiterally as well, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, but you've been passionate or you've been talking about the space since 2012, 2013 already, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, so like late 2012, January 2013, I think, thereabouts, yep. So I guess almost 8 years. It's a long time.
Yeah, it's not that long. It's not that long in crypto. I've been in the space since like late 2017, and it feels like been 10 years already. Actually.
Sure.
Yeah. And for those of you who do not know, right? I think there are a couple of things that kind of like claim to fame, if I can say so, for Balaji as well. Ex-CTO of Coinbase, used to be a general partner at A16Z as well. And before you actually became a CTO to Coinbase, you actually sold your startup to them.
Yes, that's right. Yep.
It's an email. It's a funny one. It's a unique one. It's an email startup. People actually get paid to read emails or something like that.
Yeah, so paid in cryptocurrency to reply to emails and complete tasks. So this is actually like micro tasks, like Mechanical Turk or Scale.ai. But Cameo.com, Earn.com, these are examples of like microtasking things. I think tasking is not a $1 billion market. I think it's a $1 trillion market in the medium to long term. I know it sounds obviously huge. The reason being, I think it's as big as social in the sense of just like right now, all they're doing all day is they're clicking buttons online and gaining status or losing status or whatever. But once you start going from making friends to making money, one of the things crypto does is allows you to send and receive money as easily as you can send and receive packets. So payments become packets. And that's a very big deal where like now money is built into an application at the very base layer, just like you can send and receive an image. It's as easy as that. It's not like a separate system. It's not like this antiquated system, which is FTP under the hood. It's genuinely international payments as packets. And so I think that you're going to see a lot more tasking type stuff. I think Earn was quite successful. We sold to Coinbase. It's now Coinbase Earn. You can go to coinbase.com Earn. And it's basically done hundreds of millions of dollars worth of deals with crypto issuers so that you can earn Stellar or you can earn various kinds of coins, tokens, et cetera, at Coinbase by just clicking and doing tutorials on them.
Interesting. So it's actually quite apt because 2020 is obviously, we know it as the pandemic year, the COVID year and everything like that. And obviously people are trying to find alternative ways of making money, making a living. In fact, some people are just simply making a living and everything like that. And something like this comes up and suddenly these opportunities, and if you think about it, during the last financial crisis, if I may say so, opportunities like these didn't exist in that world at that point of time. So these kind of things essentially are making an impact in like 2020 now. Am I right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yes.
What's talking about, since we're talking about 2020, what's 2020 for you? I understand correctly that you're kind of taking a sabbatical, COVID break, COVID vacation, whatever you want to call it. But basically you've kind of tried to take things easy and, focus more on working on your own thing, working on your own passions and taking a break so far for 2020? How's it been for you so far?
Well, 2020 has been a very relaxing year for everybody, as you're well aware. Yeah, no. So 2020, yeah, I've been kind of working on my stuff. I'll probably, release something on that when I'm ready. But what is 2020 to me? Well, I think 2020 starts with COVID for sure. I think I was one of the first people in certainly in tech and probably in the US to really raise the alarm on COVID and help people get set up with the remote work and so on. All of that is on Twitter. So you could see that whole thing kind of play out, which is interesting.
I did. I actually followed the whole thread and I followed the replies as well, actually.
Yeah. So it was one of those things where a lot of Americans just thought it could only happen in China, never happen in the US. And there was actually a lot of resistance to the idea. And it's like, oh, you're so paranoid. Oh, COVID. And I'm like, I just think about failure scenarios and I think about extreme scenarios. And I think this extreme scenario is nowhere near as improbable as you think it is. It was sort of like diligencing a company. You're diligencing this virus and you're trying to say, okay, what are the reasons this won't go up into the right? And unfortunately, it did. But of course, it's more fundamental than that. I have a background in biology and what have you, and I've done a lot of testing, the same kind of testing people are doing, on COVID, right? Like diagnostic testing. I've done a lot of that. So nobody's an expert in every discipline that you need for COVID-19. Nobody is, like a infectious disease specialist and an academic virologist and a diagnostics expert and a cardiologist who can opine about whether it's affecting the blood, and so all these different specialties that come together. But at least in diagnostics, I felt I could offer an opinion. So the year started for me with COVID, like it did for everybody. I think one major trend that's happened in 2020 is extreme centralization and decentralization at the same time. For example, you have states printing literally trillions of dollars and you have crypto going vertical. You have lockdowns and you have remote work. You have basically, Peter Thiel's concept of the race between politics and technology, this sort of race between state control and freedom of the network. Those two things are kind of moving, and it's not obvious which one is going to be faster at the end of the day. It's like, you go from everybody at the same time in the same year, where it's crazy to think about both things happening at the same time. Everybody must stay in their homes, and everybody can work from everywhere on anything, or everybody can work from anywhere on anything, right? So no one can go anywhere, but anyone can work from anywhere on anything. At the same time, both those happened in 2020, right?
And I guess because of that, people have an opportunity to probably take a step or even two steps back and look at what they are passionate about, right? And one of the things that I think has really started this year, and I'm just speaking from personal experience, is that, and you mentioned about crypto going vertical, right? I think the interest in crypto has really peaked a little bit, from the non-crypto people, right? People are beginning to ask questions about it. And it's not just like the same questions you have in 2017. It's actually on that note, which I wanted to ask you. You mentioned, biology and everything in your personal background. But if you talk about blockchain and crypto, what exactly is it that, appealed to you? And why are you so passionate about it? Like usually for people like yourself in the tech space, you guys will be passionate about something, but you're not going to be passionate about it for such a substantial, like 8 years, which is a pretty long time.
Sure. Yeah, it is a long time. No, it's a good question. I think, well, in the fullness of time, I think the Bitcoin white paper will be seen as being to economics what Principia Mathematica was to physics. It's like a foundational kind of thing that takes stuff that was sort of phenomenological or whatever before, and it puts it on an axiomatic, or highly mathematical grounds for further expansion. And the reason is that, what Bitcoin, what cryptocurrency does, is it turns economics, it turns the economy into a data structure. Okay. So you can now compute on the economy. That's, say, for example, the Bitcoin blockchain is the history of every transaction going back to January 3rd, 2009. Okay. So, right, before that, you had this data siloed in, JP Morgan and Wells Fargo and, this credit card company and that credit card company is all siloed all over the place. And I'm not saying, all the metadata is on chain. Of course, Y address X sent it to address Y, the purpose of that, there's metadata that's still hidden. I'm not denying that. I am, however, saying that the blockchain is like this enormous step forward. And I mean, you can track every single BTC ever down to the 100 millionth of a Bitcoin. That's amazing, and it's absolutely remarkable. It's just completely unprecedented. Where it's almost like conservation of mass. You can watch every single gram, and you can track it through with infinite precision all the way through time. We've never had something like that before. And it turns economics into, then the other thing is you can fork blockchains, right? You can make copies of them, which people have done. So you start taking things, economics has always been something that was a little bit voodoo, especially at the macro level. And the reason being, as you go from math to physics to chemistry to biology, you become less rigorous because the experiments become less reproducible. With math, a theorem is a theorem. You get to physics, and sometimes there's physical experiments that are hard to replicate. You start going up to chemistry, biology, for example. How many stories have you read about? Scientists say vitamin X, helps your blood pressure or whatever, and then you see another story a few months later. And the reason is these are like often underpowered, or there's some genomic heterogeneity in the background. Some often a pharmacogenomic kind of thing that's happening that is changing the response to that vitamin. And so you're getting conflicting results. So things get fuzzier there. And that's just biology. Now you start going up from one human to assemblies of humans. And I think microeconomics was sort of the limit of where you could make predictable, or testable predictions. Okay. You could say, all right, if you don't have a CEO for the company, it's probably not going to do well, and you can test that with your own money, and you can see if that's true. And it seems to generally be true. You can do scatter plots. It's not so long-term. It's not 100-year or whatever feedback cycle. You can at least see it in 6 months or a year or 10 years, in that thereabouts. And you can do a lot of reps. So you can run experiments in microeconomics. Once you start getting up to macroeconomics, though, historically, the only kinds of things where we could take away conclusions were things like capitalism works and communism doesn't. You take like, South Korea. Go ahead.
Totally disagree with that. Even though we're having saying this at the Singapore FinTech Festival, I think that's super underrated statement, man.
Well, so I mean by that is like, South Korea, North Korea, or South Korea has more of a developed economy than North Korea, right? And that's the same ethnic group that was just had this artificial partition. You look at Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore versus the pre-Deng Xiaoping China. You look at East Germany versus West Germany. And these are examples of essentially the same ethnic group with the same language, the same initial conditions that basically got split into what an economist would call a natural experiment. And yet one was a communist group, one was a capitalist group. And it's very visible, like what the compounding wealth creation and so on was in three very different environments. So, that's the level, I'm not trying to be super political or anything. I'm just saying that's what I mean by a controlled experiment, where you had the same kind of starting conditions or as close as you can get. And you had huge numbers of people running these things. Now, of course, communism wasn't just an experiment. A lot of people, unfortunately were killed and died and what have you. And so, you can't run these kinds of experiments ethically, until potentially virtual economies. So Edward Castronova in the early 2000s, was actually writing about this with video game economies, because those are quasi real money economies. People pay real money to at least participate in these things like EVE Online or World of Warcraft. People spend lots of time in these games, and they have real economies. Like, and things get affected. Like, okay, if you introduce a bunch of gold, if you increase the amount of gold that these monsters drop, then does that bid up the price of axes in this distant province? And how long does inflation take to get there, and so on? So there's some very interesting studies that were done by him to take a look at empirical economics in like a lower stakes environment. You're still looking at hundreds of thousands of people in a true economy. But you can run controlled experiments. You can do it a little more ethically. You can have a partition where 50,000 people are on this server and 50,000 are on that server, and they just have like a different economic policy. Maybe it's 10 gold coins for this monster and 50 gold coins for this one. You see what happens. Okay. And crypto now takes that one more level where you can have a blockchain that is a digital economy. It can be forked, and you can have two worlds with two different policies. For example, imagine if, it's 2008 and, this is not possible in the US, but you could fork and some people could get bailout dollars and some could get non-bailout dollars. And the people who got bailout dollars, people would buy the premise that, hey, we needed these bailouts to save the economy, and so on. And the folks who didn't buy that premise could say, in our world, the banks are just going to fail. We're going to fork the economy. We're going to see what happens if you don't print any money, and just let them fail and see what happens, right? And that is a very interesting compare and contrast, right? And we're now finally starting to be able to do experiments in macroeconomics thanks to crypto. And that's a huge, huge, huge thing. You've got opt-in economies with monetary policies, and you can test every economic theory you have in the world, from deflation, inflation, demurrage currencies. You want the hardest money in the world, like Bitcoin. You want something that's micropayments optimized. You want something where you think that spending is really important. You think saving is really important. Guess what? The world's your oyster. You can build whatever virtual economy you want and then see what happens.
And this is essentially virtual economies on the blockchain, if I may say so. It's not exactly the same, and this is for the audience's benefit. This isn't exactly the same as a central bank digital currency, I would say.
It's quite different. I think the central bank digital currency, it's good in a sense because it just shows that this, it's funny. We're in this Heisenberg superposition where some people still think or will maintain, Bitcoin, Ethereum, it's not that important or whatever. And yet at the same time, it's like a $500 billion sector where every government and bank in the world is aware of cryptocurrency and blockchain. So you have to give Satoshi their due. This thing started as a post on the message board, and it has affected the policy of, the Reserve Bank of China. It is, the IMF, the World Bank. I mean, if you wanted reform, this is reform, right? It is forced reforms. And that's what I think CBDCs are, is they're long overdue reforms of the financial system to make it actually more programmable, because the thing is that the entire concept of fintech and whatnot, you're basically layering on, at least in the US, it may be different in other countries, but you're layering on top of a system that just wasn't really built for what people are trying to do. It's like this antiquated engine in many ways, and the thing is that there's so many applications that are running on top of it. For example, at the lowest level, there's synchronizations using SFTP between, like banks, and that's how they true up all the debits and credits of one person, for example. So it's like text files, which don't have relational guarantees, which can't do, there's 1,000 things that are wrong with that, right? Like You're transferring flat files and FTP as the economy. Yeah. And so if the only thing that crypto did was it gave an excuse to modernize the economy, the fintech backend, that's a big deal right there, right? But it's more than that, because it's really in a sense, we're going back to the future, because 1950 was sort of peak centralization. You had one telephone company and you had two superpowers and three television stations in the US, right? ABC, CBS, NBC. But before that, if you go backwards in time from 1950, you had way more diversity of outlets and voices, way, way more things that were out there. And you go further back and you have all the entrepreneurs, the people call them robber barons. You had all of these, you had private currencies that banks issued and so on. And there's really a time of just enormous innovation and whatnot. Then a lot of that sort of got killed, and it all canalized into this very homogeneous environment of the 1950s, where you have two big blocks and they slug it out, and it's like very minimal choice and homogeneous in many ways. And now, since 1950, things have opened up. You start going and you get cable television, and you get the fall of the USSR and the rise of the internet, and then huge explosion of things over the last 20 years. So things are opening up and they're decentralizing in a big way. And so I think crypto is a huge piece of this. And I think that I think people don't realize that our future is more similar to like the early 1800s than it is to the 1950s. Policy is, so technology is dependent on policy, but policy is actually also dependent on technology. And so it is bidirectional, and let me explain why. For example, remote work means that you have a more competitive market for governments than has ever been there before. I don't think people fully realize what this means, but once anyone can work from anywhere, you're going to have groups of entrepreneurs that start collective bargaining with governments. Right now, what it is it's Tesla, it's Amazon, it is Boeing that go and negotiate a Gigafactory deal, for example, or the HQ2 deal or Boeing deal in South Carolina. That doesn't have to be done within corporate vehicles. The only reason that's done in corporate vehicles is that's where you have a CEO who can represent 10,000 people at once, right? So it's relatively unusual right now. There's nothing that says that you can't do that as a group of entrepreneurs or a group of citizens that organizes in a Facebook group and says, hey, we're 25,000 engineers. What can you give us? We'll all move to your country, right? And can you legalize drones, right? Can you legalize a cryptocurrency, for DeFi or what have you, right? And crucially, they're not asking for money. They're not asking for a subsidy. They're just asking to put a line through a law which doesn't cost you anything. And in fact, imposing a new law often does cost you something. You have to enforce it and all the type of stuff, right? And so this is a very, very important factor, mobility. Mobile is making us more mobile. And especially when the vaccine hits, I think that's going to be a huge thing where folks are going to want to travel to try to bring down regulatory barriers around the world. Now, on the other hand, it is certainly true that regulations affect technology. I mean, that's just one example of remote. But if I talk about drones, I talk about AI, I talk about crypto and encryption, technology is changing really the scope of what is even regulatable. Like end-to-end encryption means you can't really easily regulate private speech. Not that I think you should, but you often cannot, right? And so cannot puts it out of the realm of should or should not. Cannot is a different thing. It's out of the capability. And I think the extent to which you can push encryption is going to be a very, very important question. Encryption on computer networks. The question of how far you can push that, like how much you can do encrypted, is going to be super important because there's a famous saying: no amount of violence can solve certain kinds of math problems. For example, with remote work, you can have citizens group together and they can go and negotiate collective bargain with governments. And they may say, hey, can you liberalize your drone laws, and we'll bring a bunch of drone entrepreneurs there, similar to how Amazon did HQ2 and Tesla did the Gigafactory and Google initially did Google Fiber. And Boeing negotiated with South Carolina, except rather than a corporation helmed by a CEO that's doing the negotiations, it is a group of citizens that's doing the negotiations. And that's, I think, a very powerful concept, that you can now have essentially a two-sided marketplace of citizens on the one hand and governments on the other, and governments actually start competing for the best citizens. Part of what's making this possible also is, remote work is a big thing, search is a big thing, translation is a big thing. In a sense, obviously the coronavirus vaccine is a form of technology. If one or more of those vaccines work as well as the initial results seem to indicate they are. It's always devil in the details, but hopefully it can be scaled up and distributed and so on fast enough to make a real dent in coronavirus worldwide by 12 to 18 months from now, maybe sooner. Then I think you're going to get a burst of maybe revenge travel, where all this pent up demand, people are like, woo, and we hope so.
I 100% think, actually 100% think, revenge travel and revenge spending will happen.
And I think a big part of that is going to be, once people are loosed and they can go remote, they will. And that's super important, because that's a complementary force that brings, like old laws down, because now you have an incentive to bring in 25,000 engineers if you just shelve this old law from 1953 or whatever that is preventing people from forming new companies. And one of the reasons is really old laws often are written and they envision a certain kind of technology. For example, telephony or television or mail regulations conceptualize those as three different things. But now you make telephone calls and you broadcast TV shows and you send email all through the same internet connection. And in Gmail, you can do all three, And in the same way, like old school, financial regulations conceptualize stocks and bonds and commodities and, mortgages and so on as different things. But on chain, you can mix and match these, you can compose them in DeFi. It's just a different world. You have to start thinking about it from first principles as a different thing. And just applying old regulations doesn't necessarily make sense. And so that's something where the technology affects a policy. It is a bidirectional thing.
Okay. Yeah. I'm gonna, so let's I always ask this, anybody I interview or have a conversation with, I always like to ask them to give me a relatable example. So since this is the Singapore FinTech Festival, I'm just gonna use Singapore. I know you're a fan of Singapore and you've got a lot of good things to say about it, but like what does a decentralized Singapore, if I can even say so, am I even using the right word to describe a city state like Singapore, which I live in now, right? Like, what does it look like? What do you think a decentralized Singapore would potentially look like, and what are the advantages of it being so?
Okay, well, so first, I think Singapore is going to be a very important example for the 21st century in terms of just one of the best run countries in the world, punches way above its weight. I'm not just saying that because it's the MAS and so on. I've been saying that for a long time in totally different contexts, have nothing to do with Singapore. I really love the country because it, as Lee Kuan Yew, wrote, it went from third world to first. He showed that it is totally possible to bootstrap, and it was an inspiration for China to bootstrap itself after, like Lee Kuan Yew actually mentored Deng Xiaoping, and that story is well known. And certainly an inspiration for folks also in India. Singapore is well respected in India, in China, in America. It's kind of this neutral. It's a Switzerland, of Asia, right? In many ways. So, what would a decentralized Singapore look like? I think, first, the concept of starting your own currency or a new currency was insane back in like 2008. What were you going to do? Petition the IMF or the World Bank? And then Satoshi figured out a way to do it, and it worked, against all odds, it's worked, and it's created this whole thing, amazing technological and conceptual set of breakthroughs. And I think that today, the concept of starting your own city, starting a new city, that sounds crazy, but it's happening. Cul-de-sac, for example, others. So basically, starting your own city is possible, and that's happening. And of course, that's legal to do. There's unincorporated territory in the U.S. It's obviously thousands of cities and towns. There has to be a process for starting a new one. It's not that exceptional. It's just not something that people normally think is a thing you could do. They sort of accept that the physical environment, at least in the US and in Western countries, they think of it as read only. Okay, meaning you walk down the street, you don't think, oh yeah, let me put a telephone pole there. Right? You don't have the power to do that. That's like, oh, can I do that? I can't do that. You can at most move a chair around your house, right? That's a slightly editable environment. You're not actually able to hack it. And so we don't really think about that too much. But then when you get on the computer, it's fully editable. You can do anything. You can build $1 billion startup at your computer. You can shape and move around. Like if you know Amazon, you can move the servers, make everything, you're just like this sculptor on the computer, right? Okay. So one of the big ideas I've had is, what if you built a virtual city in the cloud, okay, and then you materialized it? And specifically, I have this tweet which I'll see if I can read. So, how to start a new city: build a community in the cloud, organize the economy around remote work, enforce laws with smart contracts, practice in-person norms of civility, simulate the architecture in VR. Eventually crowdfund territory, and then materialize the city into the real world. And the key concept is to go cloud first and land last, build a community online, don't worry about real estate, and then basically crowdfund territory once you've got the opportunity to do so. And a critical concept here is 1 million Estonians could afford Estonia. We don't normally think of it that way, but most of the property of Estonia is held by Estonians. And so as such, like if you could get 1 million people who are truly, truly, truly committed to something, they could probably purchase a physical footprint the size of Estonia, maybe not all in one chunk, but in enclaves and so on around the world, and you network them together. It's a very powerful concept. I'm writing long form stuff on this. You can follow me on Twitter for more on it. But this is something which I call like the emergence of the network state, as opposed to the nation state. And it's sort of like the sequel to it, where it lives online fundamentally, and then it has sort of physical projections, almost like you'd print out a document. You have physical protrusions, enclaves, that are held by this network state in the physical world, but it fundamentally lives online. The soul of the people is online. And so that's, I think, how you'd start building something like a decentralized Singapore. You have all these cities and towns and so on around the world, but they fold into the state that's in the cloud. And those people who are in there think of themselves as one unit. One analogy for this, by the way, like the office of Google or Facebook, that's like a multinational, and everybody thinks of themselves as a Google employee, even if they're going to Google, Denmark or Google Bangalore, or Google Kyoto. Their pass opens the door and they can go and walk in. And probably what's going to happen post-corona is you're going to see a lot more people take advantage of that and essentially be full-time digital nomads doing remote work, where they walk into the office and it just works, and they're hacking on Google. A lot of people did this before, but I think it's going to get next level, especially once you're paying San Francisco salaries globally. And that's a huge step. Reddit and others are now taking the step where Gumroad's taking the step. They stopped geo-adjusting it. Sometimes what people will do is they'll just require you to be in a certain time zone.
Yes.
Right. And so what's interesting is, and this is not original to me, I actually don't know who to attribute to, but if you know, that'd be great. But historically the world was organized on there's similarity by latitude. You make this kind of crop at this latitude, and then there's equatorial latitudes and Arctic latitudes, right? But increasingly the world is going to start getting organized by longitude, where vertical stripes as opposed to horizontal stripes are the fundamental unit of economic organization, because that's how you can work together synchronously. And that's like that's a new way of, go ahead.
Basically, you're saying the future of work is going to be very much based on time zones, and you're creating, and if that's true, you're essentially creating the real 24-hour workforce, where it's a pure 24-hour workforce, where you've got people, whether they are devs, business people, marketing people, whatever it is, where essentially they are working, covering longitudes accordingly.
Exactly, that's right. And so what that means, by the way, is like, working in South America or in, Northern Canada, you can basically have potentially much lower living costs and still be on an American time zone, for example, right? You can live in the Bahamas. Or if you're working in Europe, you could go and, if you want to, you could live in a cheaper place in Europe, as long as you're plus minus 2 or 3 hours. You'll overlap enough in the time zone. I think roughly plus minus 3 hours is roughly right. So you've got at least 5-6 hours of overlap in the day. If it's much more than that, if it's 8 hours, it's too little. And so what you might start to find are basically people who are doing vertical, like time zone arbitrage, where people are sort of aligned physiologically. Singapore, by the way, is also very well positioned for this, because if you were looking at, there's a great website, I think it's called like timezones.is or something like that. I want to say time.is, but I'll tell you the website.
I think I've heard of it. Time zone.
Yeah, it's time.is. That's the one. And it has this great thing where it's like time.is /time_zones. Okay. And it's a list of countries grouped by current UTC offset. So it's super cool. So you can be like, okay, who is in UTC 12? Well, U.S. minor outlying islands, Baker Island, Howland Island, right? And so Singapore is like UTC +8. So it's got, big chunks, obviously, of Russia, the Philippines, India, China. It might be one of the best places in the world from a time zone perspective. And, like a combination of good time zone and good government. So that's something where Singapore's addressable market has massively increased. And a lot of these smaller city states, Dubai is also well positioned. Estonia is well positioned. Monaco, the Bahamas, all of those places are well positioned if they are just near other large population centers from a time zone standpoint.
So essentially, in conclusion, it's not where you are based, but the longitude you're based that's going to be important.
Yeah, and this is like what I'm describing is like a multi-generational or even century-long process. Because but you can imagine that the right shape for a polity will be more like Chile, like vertical versus horizontal.
Interesting.
Because all those people can work in the same time zone, so you'll see companies start to rather than going horizontal, they'd go vertical to start.
Right. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to jump in very quickly on 2 questions I really want to ask you, and then we can basically wrap it up.
Sure.
I think I mean, look, given how long you've been in crypto, I think I can't not ask you this, which is basically what I call the Michael Saylor, Jack Dorsey question.
Sure.
Is that, we talk about the future of work. Let's talk about the future of companies very, very quickly, just to wrap up the last so-called big question, which is, will we see more tech companies? I know hedge funds do this. I know banks will sooner or later do this, right? And I think there's no discussion. Will we see more of such tech companies where they put a certain portion of their capital or P&L into cryptocurrencies, very similar to what Square has done?
Yeah. Not only do I think every company does it, I think every company and every individual becomes a fund and an investor. So just talking about that for a second, you know how people in the 1800s, they sort of bemoaned the loss of farming jobs and going into manufacturing, and that was really bad, and so on and so forth. And that led to, frankly, communism and other stuff. There's a huge societal adaptation. There's a huge disruptive change to the way of life going from farming to manufacturing, right?
Yep.
Okay, now what's interesting is that cursed manufacturing job, after a few generations, became the thing that was romanticized. And now in the 80s and the 90s and 2000s, everyone's like, oh, all the manufacturing jobs are going away. Oh, that stable 9-to-5 job. Now that's the thing that was stable, not the farming job, which is too far distant in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And that manufacturing job is going away, and what's going to replace it? And I actually think that what is going to replace it is being staring us in the face, but it's not obvious. It's one of those things that's like super obvious if I point it out, but it's also something that people will argue with. But I think that what happens is that everyone becomes an investor. Okay. And why do I say that? Well, first is, the number of investors is vastly increasing thanks to Robinhood, thanks to crypto, thanks to all that type of stuff. And we're talking whoosh, tens of millions of people, have learned what, depth charts are. They've learned supply and demand. So that is actually, in a very important but subtle way, recruiting for capitalism worldwide.